So good evening, everybody. Good evening. Y'all are not that lively. Good evening.
Good evening.
So I'm going to try to keep, actually, my initial comments short, probably about 10 minutes. And then let's have a dialogue. I think it's much better, and I know I'm much better actually answering questions than just talking at people. So I want to move to that and just really kind of give you a context to how we got onto this track, how we got to the point that we're at, the challenges we are facing right now, and how we are moving and aiming to go forward. Because it's not a project and it's not an experiment without some issues, without some challenges, without some contradictions. And I think it's important to put all of that in play. And I want to just make it, as practical as possible. We have to win all of these struggles ultimately on the ground. And while all of our work, I believe, should have a theoretical basis, it should be applicable. So just want to talk about that as much as possible. But in terms of background, I think one of the key things to really understand about our work in Jackson is that what you're really looking at is the Chokwe's victory in the mayoral seat in 2013. Many people look at that as kind of a defining moment. To a certain extent, it was. But I think if you don't take into account the 40-plus years of organizing that he himself put into that community, you kind of really miss the point. And people think that this was something that just kind of emerged somewhat spontaneously or out of nowhere, and that completely misses the point. It took a lot of years of organizing for us to get to that point and to really root ourselves in that community. And it's critical to understand in that context, even though Chokwe has some southern roots, his original roots are in the state of Alabama. He was born in Detroit, and so he moved to Jackson. And Jackson, like a lot of southern communities, can be very provincial in the sense that Jackson is one of those places, roughly about 70–80% of the people who live in Jackson were born and raised in Jackson, and they've been there for generations. And who your family is and what your social relationships are very, very important in that context. So kind of coming in, from the outside and being able to kind of organically tie yourself to the community really takes some time and a lot of dedicated work. But it's not work that he did alone, and I think that's a critical piece just to understand. I'm just going to use him as a kind of a figurehead for this point just to illustrate that. So to understand where a lot of this comes from, there are many different kind of streams that led to the creation of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the New African People's Organization. Those are the two kind of political forces, the New African People's Organization being the kind of the cadre organization, the real political center that gave birth to the Malcolm X grassroots movement as more of a mass organization. And this, the New African People's Organization was really the merge of forces from 4 different organizations in the early 1980s. And then the Malcolm X grassroots movement was born in 1990, first as a coalition and then as an organization unto itself. So you're talking about 25 years just with MXGM alone of organizing, primarily in the South, but throughout different parts of the United States as well. Now, just to kind of fast forward to Jackson and how we got to that point. So the Malcolm X grassroots movement was actually born in Jackson, Mississippi. Even though it became a national organization, it was actually born in Jackson, Mississippi. And it was born during a time when Jackson was making his kind of fateful transition from being majority white to majority black. And that's a critical thing to note, is that Jackson, unlike a lot of other cities in the United States in this 50s, 60s, and 70s that became majority black or had large black kind of concentrations. Jackson was relatively late in that development. It really didn't happen until the mid-1980s. And what that meant, and which still has a profound impact in our context, was that the white flight from Jackson was swifter and kind of more complete than it was in a lot of other places throughout the United States. It wasn't as gradual. It wasn't like there was a 20-year period of folks leaving. It was basically from the mid-1970s, from like 1975 to 1980, it was like a mad rush, basically, to kind of get out of there. And that has some profound impact on one of the contradictions I want to talk about later, and one of the challenges that we're facing, which is the threat of our water system being privatized from decades of institutional neglect and systemic racism. Because they knew this system had to be fixed in the 1960s, but chose not to, in large part because of anticipating these demographic shifts, right? So something to be aware of. But we came to the Jackson-Kush plan, which is what the strategy which led us to Chokwe being elected and Cooperation Jackson being built. We came to that primarily for two reasons. One was September 11th, and what we understood that meant for organizing within the United States empire. And why was that so critical to us? You know, the Malcolm X grassroots movement is one of the things I think is internationally known for, is work around for two things that are interrelated, even though it's never been the subtotal of what we do, but it's probably gotten the most international coverage of popularity. One is organizing cop watches, so stuff against police brutality. And the other one is organizing around political prisoners, prisoners of war, and political exiles. And probably the most noted expression of that has been our Black August concerts, international concerts, which have brought Talib and Mos Def and Dead Prez and all those folks together, primarily in New York, for about a decade, beginning in the late 1990s. And we were doing a lot of concentrated work in the late 1990s to try to get some of the political prisoners out, because we felt that, for a lot of different reasons, which I won't get into, that a lot of the folks who had been in at that point, some for about 30 years, that there was some glimmer of hope that many of them might be able to get out. And we're talking about members of from different organizations, but the main that were members of the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the Republic of New Africa, the Movement Organization, and the American Indian Movement, as well as the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, right? As well as some members of May 19th and the Weather Underground, who were very much tied to kind of our political history and tendency. And that there seemed to be some glimmer of hope around getting them out. In particular, there were two cases during the late 90s that had been building to gain a certain level of international kind of recognition. The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal and the case of Leonard Peltier. In the late 1990s, many of you might remember, I think it was 1997, there was the issued a death execution order for Mumia. And the movement was successfully able to kind of halt that. We weren't able to get him out, unfortunately, but we did halt that. And that kind of raised things to a new level. And part of what we were doing to try to move that effort forward, we were organizing a conference. It was going to be held in the spring of 2002 in Cuba. So it's the International Conference about American Political Prisoners, Prisoners of War, and Political Exiles. And folks should know that Cuba harbors or hosts, depending on your perspective, a good number of political exiles from the United States, right? Some estimates well over 100. Asada just being the most famous of those exiles. So we wanted to do that for a lot of strategic reasons. September 11th changed that immediately. It just basically evaporated all of that work. And just as a detour, I was in South Africa, in Tanzania, on September 11th, because the World Conference Against Racism had just finished, had just concluded its work there. And part of what I was tasked to do, in that part more in the youth division of the work, I brought a group of students from California, where I was living at the time, to that conference, specifically to do work around reparations. And one of the larger kind of goals, another piece of work that I did mention that we were kind of, where I was more concentrated in, was doing work around reparations. And we had a specific aim and objective there to get slavery and the slave trade recognized as a crime against humanity. And then, to be able to then therefore charge European governments, Canada, United States, and the Vatican for crimes against humanity, and therefore some form of restitution and reparations. So we kind of got that in the official text. And that was considered to be a victory in some respects. And this is after about a decade of work on an international level, but in the United States through COBRA, which Chokwe was one of the founding members of, which is the National Coalition of Black Reparations in America, that had been doing a lot of work, and it got to that kind of critical point. So we were looking at both the work that was taking place in the civil society space and the kind of coalition that had really been built around the African bloc, the South American kind of bloc, some remnants of what many might know as the Non-Aligned Movement, or the G77, and kind of taken up this cause and got a lot of good things in the text to a certain extent. So we looked at that as being a victory. Then September 11th hit. And I was there in South Africa. I initially thought that the two planes going into the two towers, and this is no joke, I thought that when I first saw it, that one of my friends and comrades, Boots Riley from the Coup, they had just released an album in July of 2001 called Party Music. And on the cover was the two towers on fire. That was the original cover. And so when I initially saw it, I thought that my boy Boots had made it to CNN. Now, I'm not joking. I thought, oh, Boots, they getting some coverage on CNN. And the person that brought it to my attention was like, no, this is something else. It's something totally different. And I guess by the time I saw really caught the TV screen, I think within 5 minutes of me sitting there watching the screen and kind of realizing what was going on, the first tower fell. So I saw that, and instantaneously I knew the reparation conversation is over, the political prisoner conversation is over, much of our strategy is over, it's done, right? And we are going to have to kind of start over from a particular scratch, but it also meant a certain realization, particularly for our tendency within the United States and their history, that certain forms of the organization and the work that we've been doing basically was over. In large part because I immediately understood, and I think most of the people in our organization understood, that what was going to come out of that, particularly with the Bush administration, and the plan that we had already knew that they had. There was what was it called? There was a Contract for America, and then there was a New American paper or something that the New American Century, there it is, that had been written. So we had read that and studied that. So we knew that they were going to take this full tilt as an opportunity to institute the most, draconian aspects and the most aggressive aspects of their platform. This was an opportunity, just laid out for them. We knew that. And so we were going to have to change everything because we understood that COINTELPRO, which had done tremendous damage to the Black liberation movement. I'm really consider myself a child of COINTELPRO in a lot of respects. Saw that devastate my parents' generation, very up close in a personal way. That with though it was technically illegal in the United States by law, and there had been some pushback in the mid-'70s, with some congressional hearings about it, and they kind of changed and tweaked the little rules here, that we knew that everything that was once illegal was going to become legal, and that the state was going to be taking on a whole new aggressive tone. So we had to try to figure out how to reorganize ourselves. So that was 2001. 4 years later, New Orleans is hit, the Gulf Coast is really hit by Hurricane Katrina. And a lot of the different things that we had been theorizing about how the U.S. empire was now relating particularly to black people and to black labor. New Orleans really kind of brought that home, that some of our worst fears had really come to be realized. That here you have a situation where there was intentional neglect. You know, they let people die. They let people drown. That was very intentional. It wasn't by coincidence, it wasn't by accident. They deliberately did not go in and do a number of different things. They deliberately moved in military forces first to control the situation and to move people out. That we kind of realized that there was a new kind of dynamic that we needed to really give some special attention to, and that we need to reposition, reorganize our work. Now, in the context of this, you got to remember, going back from 2001, we had already been thinking about how do we do things differently? How do we organize ourselves differently? So out of that came a little think tank within the organization. So it was already trying to, you know, we were studying anything and everything that we could get our hands on that we thought, you know, could be of use in some form or fashion. So there was a certain tendency within the organization that was heavily influenced by the Zapatistas. There was a certain tendency within the organization, you know, more than within my generation, that was really studying at that time what was going on in Venezuela. So, you know, just some examples of things that we were kind of picking up, and ideas, well, we think this might work in the U.S. context, this might not work in the U.S. context. But we really, at that time, we were thinking about it, but there was no place that we were really trying to put it in practice until Katrina. And our initial attempt at doing it, Katrina, failed and failed miserably. I won't even go into that, but it failed and failed miserably. So there was a kind of a regroupment around, I think about 2007, of saying we got this study group, we tried to do some things, but given the dynamics of New Orleans at the time, where more than half of the population was not even back, and it was very clear that the dynamics were not going to allow most of particularly the black working class population to come back. Where could we reconcentrate, reposition ourselves? Where do we have the greatest strength, and where could we have the greatest impact? And after a lot of thinking, we sat there and looked at where we had our origin, Jackson. There was already a base. We already had some experience in the late 80s and 1990s, somewhat successfully at doing kind of a people's assembly kind of a model. And then we had saw right in the beginning of Katrina, the response that came out of Jackson was one of the most dynamic responses actually to that particular crisis. It's not as well documented, but a lot of the central work, as you wind up seeing, particularly the first year, actually was headquartered in Jackson. And then I was in New Orleans. I had moved to New Orleans. I was ordered to go to New Orleans shortly after the storm, and I lived there for 3 years. And so, being a part of this group, we started thinking, okay, what do we need to do to maximize our strength and the existing strength of the community that's there? You know, to use kind of neoliberal language, what value added do we really bring to the equation, right? And so we really tried to sit down and study both, you know, what would the objective conditions kind of bring to bear? Like, what was possible in this space and in this time? And then what, based upon the coalition strength that kind of already existed, which we were part of, what could it do? And then if we added a few things to it and organized in some different ways, what could we then bring to it? And then we quickly kind of landed that there was both a need, but also we believe the capacity to do 3 things: people's assemblies. Again, there was some prior experience. And then we were trying to, at that time, really draw off models from a lot of different places throughout the world. We sent some people different places to study, you know, models in Brazil, models in Venezuela. Myself and some other folks had been down to Chiapas a couple of different times. And we kind of saw some things that might work, and then we said, well, ultimately, we're going to have to test this out in the ground, and it's going to take on its own life and its own form here, right? Despite all whatever theoretical kind of gravitas that we can pull to it. But try to bring those pieces to bear and then have it play out itself. So the People's Assembly as a dual power, right? And this was talking to somebody earlier, this was, we were very clear at this point, this is around 2008, that the People's Assembly had been in motion, but it was still kind of developing its character. And we were very clear that we wanted it to be a space that could do 2 things. Number 1, put maximum pressure on the state, on the government. And the other piece was to figure out what were the things that it could stimulate the community to organize for itself, by itself. just to give you a context, you know, Mississippi is always up there, number one. Number two is the poorest state within the United States. It's always up there, right? To give you some more context to kind of our work, which will come into play later. Jackson, Mississippi, the official unemployment rate is 12%. Now, in the United States, the way that they count unemployment, they only count people who are actively looking for work. The real unemployment rate in Mississippi is about 50%. You can go knock on any door in almost any house in the black neighborhood. Any time of day, there's an adult there who will answer the door. Just to give you a sense of what I mean by, you know, you can't take official statistics, but I can go knock on any door, somebody's going to answer that door. You know, an adult, not a child, an adult is going to answer that door. So that just gives you a real sense of, you know, where people are at materially and where they're at in their employment, right, and how the economy is structured in our context. So the second thing, in terms of this strategy, was building an independent political force, an independent political party. Now, why is that important? So there's some particularities to Mississippi that folks should also know. In the 1960s, there was an experiment that happened in Mississippi, which most people think ended, but it actually didn't. There was a challenge to the official Democratic Party delegation in 1964, which wound up leading to the construction of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, right? So many of you might know Fannie Lou Hamer. She was kind of the voice and the face of that particular party experiment, which in large part grew out of SNCC and out of COFO, right? Which was a coalition of civil rights organizations that had come together to work some things out in Mississippi in the mid-60s. So that project, many people think it kind of ended in 1968. It still exists. It still, you know, has this kind of dual ballot line. So, and we have always kind of had a strategy of all of the folks who live in Mississippi are registered members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Not of the Democratic Party, but of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So that piece has always been there. And because of how that particular struggle played out, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party can still run and participate in the Democratic Party primary. And given the nature of the politics and where, you know, particularly the Democrats as a national party really kind of fit into things, they don't, until here recently, they're changing their tune now, but until here recently, they don't really send any money or make any investment or call any shots in Mississippi. It's just kind of written off. Like, we know the black community is going to vote Democrat. We know we're going to hold all those seats. And we know that black people don't constitute a majority, so they can't hold a statewide office like the governor, that we just don't have the capacity to win it. And that you can, Mississippi is such a state that if you look at it, when you look at the next national election in 2018, you look at who, you know, the Democrats, who wins the Democrats and who wins, you know, which Democrats wins and which Republican wins. Everything pretty much to the west of the state is going to be blue. Everything to the east of the state is going to be red. Now, what does that mean? Blue is the Democrats. Blue is where the black folks are concentrated. So where we're concentrated, that's automatically pretty much going to go to the Democrats. Where white folks are concentrated, which is more in the east, that's pretty much going to go all to the Republicans. So the parties are split pretty much along racial lines, you know, to this day. Republicans are white, Democrats are blue. That's the general, that's not absolute, but that's the general equation. So we are trying to change that dynamic, right, for a lot of different reasons. And the dynamic that we're trying to change is, number one, the Democratic Party locally, regionally, nationally does not represent the interests of black people, particularly black working class people, or basically anybody else at this point in time. So let's kind of recognize that fact, organize in our own interests, organize on our own base, to create our own political party. That was the thinking. Okay, so then the third part, just to speed up. The third part was building the solidarity economy. And in Mississippi, given what I told you about the unemployment, so it's not just that there's, you know, kind of a huge unemployment rate. There really, we exist in a space that there really never, the capacity, the industrial capacity, as folks kind of left, Mississippi's still primarily agricultural state, but most of the agriculture now is lumber, right? It's trees. And that gets cultivated about every 10 years. And that's cultivated by machines, not primarily by humans. So the need for human beings to actually work in the farms has long since disappeared from Mississippi, and it disappeared for intentional reasons, right? So the Mississippi gets a lot of subsidization from the federal government and the farm agency to actually not produce certain crops, to not produce certain things in excise. Farmers get paid not to produce, right? That's a particular, I think Canada has some of that too, but I don't think to the extent the United States does. But what that meant was in the 1960s and 70s, that large parts of the black population that lived in those rural counties who were doing agricultural work were just totally uprooted and had to go to cities like Jackson or Dallas or Memphis, right? And by the time that they entered into the urban centers in the late 1970s and 80s, all these places were deindustrializing. So there was no work there, period, to begin with. And since Jackson never really developed as a major industrial hub, it's a transport hub, but not an industrial hub, there were no jobs. So that's just been a permanent state of how people lived and have learned how to survive and manage, right? So in our sense, building the solidarity economy has also meant kind of building the productive forces, actually providing jobs where none have really ever existed. So that's a different type of challenge than I think a lot of other people who are trying to build a solidarity economy in different contexts might be facing, right? So for us, we actually have a developmental role that we're trying to play, which is normally the job of another set of class forces, not ours. So those are kind of the three components of the theory that we laid out based upon the conditions, and then we then trying to put in motion. And the piece that got the most kind of attention nationally was the electoral position, not the other work in the trenches of doing the assembly and doing that other kind of stuff. So we had 9 months in office where we got elected. And it was a very rocky and a very testy 9 months. I think folks should understand that. We learned a lot, and we're still learning a lot. Because, I believe we just have to be honest with each other. We had a lot of struggles in that 9 months about what was the proper course of action. And it really tested our unity. I was one so let me back up just one step. So Chokwe never wanted to run for electoral office. Folks should know that. Never wanted to run for the electoral office. We forced him to do that. I was one of two people who came up with the idea that he should run. And he resisted heavily to that idea. But we said, comrade, under discipline, this is the majority decision. This is what you're going to do, right? And so he submitted, he did his best job. But there wound up being some tensions once he became mayor between, I think, a set of notions around, am I here to just execute our strategy, or am I here to govern the city effectively? And we had a lot of tension around that. And to just be transparent, I was one who was holding the position, we are here to execute our program. We are not here to try to manage the contradictions of capitalism. It's impossible. We cannot do it, especially in Mississippi. We can't do that. It's not our job, not our role. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't fix the streets or repair the potholes and try to do that. But ultimately, it's not where we should be spending the vast majority of our time. The vast majority of our time was what we called it was making all the fundamental questions of governance mass questions. And to try to take the governing of the city for the 4 years that we were going to hold that office, to take all of, or as much of the power as possible out of City Hall and put it back into the community. And what that meant was, we were going to not just do a small portion, to give you a sense of what we mean by that. We weren't just going to do a small portion of the city's budget in a participatory manner. We were going to do the entire budget on a participatory line and take it and open up the entire thing. Now, I should say one of the reasons why we were pushing that was to really try to do the experiment of getting rid of the police. But that's a whole nother conversation if folks want to have it, right? And because in Jackson, Mississippi, the police occupy roughly about 30% of the city's budget, right? And it's a city of 200,000 people with a police force of about 5,000 people. You add it up, it's far bigger than it needs to be in a city like Jackson, okay? So that was one of the things, but it was also just to reorganize the priorities of how the budget actually is spent. Because, you know, our theory was if mothers were governing the budget, how different would it really look than how it's currently structured? We believed, and we didn't get a chance to play that out, but we believed the social service component would skyrocket tremendously. And then let's say we could create the structures where we're not only controlling the budget, but you control the administration of those funds on the neighborhood level. So that was, we were trying to kind of decentralize that and take it out of City Hall, take it really out of the mayor's hand to the extent possible, and try to do a radical experiment in that nature. We started to really toy with it, but we didn't really get the chance. And then part of the thing, and some of this was, there was a conversation that many of us in this room were having earlier, which is going to be heavily on my mind for a couple of days, at least if not some months, because it was very good. I'm glad I was able to be here for that. And so one of the central tensions that emerged there that was also central to us was how fast and hard do we move our program? That was another part of the tension. Again, I was one, let's hit it hard, let's hit it now, and you know, let's not wait. So, you know, we know pretty much who is who in the small city. We know who they are. We kind of know what their position was. I was like, let's move all our people into the positions that can be filled by our people, and let's pass all the legislation that can be passed in favor of what we want to do within the first 3 months. That was my position. Within the first 3 months, let's not give the opposition time to organize. We debated that for 3 months. All right, once we were in, that was the original position we all agreed upon. But once we were in, we debated that for 3 months. And we made some critical mistakes. One of the critical mistakes was our city, this was before Chokwe came into the mayoralship. Our city has a very antiquated infrastructure, but the worst of it is our water delivery system. It's terrible. It's old. It's about 120 years old with huge lead pipes that kind of feed everything, which are just contaminated, you know, in more ways than one. So this goes back to that intentional neglect that I was talking about. So the city had known that this was, the federal government told them this needed to be fixed as early as 1972, the year I was born. So this has been sitting on the agenda that long. And so they just kicked it down the road, kicked it down the road, kicked it down the road, and eventually, in 2008, the federal government stepped in and started saying, if you guys don't do something about this, we will. So our city now has what's called a consent decree, which means you're on the clock. If you don't fix this, we're going to take it over and you won't have any control over it. So they gave us 17 years, basically from 2010 to fix it. So the clock is ticking on us fast. So the previous administration came up with some crazy, corrupt backdoor deal with Siemens, you know, the international German-based corporation to fix the first phase of the water. So in the 3 months that we were kind of arguing how fast and all this thing goes, when we had time to reverse this contract, we didn't. And what that wind up the consequence of that was in January of 2014, the new water bills came in. And the water bills jumped on average from about $50 a month to about $120 a month. All right, and Jackson is kind of it's a city where there's some just very distorted kind of population dynamics. So you have a considerable part of the population which is under 21. Then there's a gap between 21 and about 50. And because of most of the folks who are there, you know, kind of their prime working years, because the economy is so bad, they leave, right? So you have then another, you know, our population kind of looks like this, if you were put it on the grid. So then there's a high spike of folks 50 and over. And it's the 50 and over folks who in the electoral process really determine what goes on. Because They're of a generation which is very close and very remember the days of apartheid, and they associate voting in a totally different way than young people do. Right? There's a different association and different meaning to it for them, so they come out and vote faithfully, typically. So when that group got hit, which is a large portion of it is on fixed income, right? That $70 jump was very critical. We had failed to explain to people that that was going to happen, and then more importantly, we didn't follow our own principle of making things a mass question as we said we were going to do. So because we didn't do a certain amount of education in the community, when it popped up and people got hit, we were left with no explanation and no real solid way of what the hell are we going to do about it. And then Chokwe died. Remember, this happens, the first bill coming in January, Chokwe dies in February, right? So we are then kind of left essentially flat-footed, because there's a special election which is called, which was basically a month after he died, they were going to have a special election, and there were 20 people who jumped in that election, including his son. His son made it to the second round against another challenger. And his son lost by basically 3,000 votes. Now there was a dynamic that happened, again, tied to this. The voter turnout dropped. When his father ran, the voter turnout was the highest it had ever been in Jackson. Right, so that gives you a sense that, we had done some of our work right. We've touched a lot of people who normally didn't vote. The second go around, they just didn't show up. Thank you all.
For all of you coming out tonight, Brother Kelly for coming out, sharing your words and your experiences, the movements and the organizing that's happening here in Toronto. Thank you for the work you all are doing. And folks who supported and did a lot of the background work, thank you. NetVive, Socialist Project in the Center for Social Change, thank you. We'll see you soon. JFAT meets the first and third Wednesday right here at 6 o'clock. You're all more than welcome to come out. It's an action anti-poverty group.